So it was a beautiful sunny morning. I climbed out of bed, seemingly all alone. I was about to make a start on breakfast when I heard the banging at the door. I went downstairs to find out who it was. The man was big, unshaven, screaming bloody murder, thrashing his fists against the wooden panel. He demanded that I let him in, and if not, he said he would frickin' kill me. I attacked quickly because the door panel was coming loose from the door frame. If he kept it up, it was going to break down for sure and he would have ripped me apart. He obviously had quite a bit of strength, which I couldn't say the same about myself, so I would not be able to stop him on my own. This was clearly a matter for the local police station. I told him I was calling the cops and I went back upstairs to the kitchen with a knife block. Fortunately for me, the police did arrive and apprehended the man, so I lived happily ever after. This is all something that really happened to me a couple of years ago, but I haven't really thought about it much since then, other than it was a pretty interesting way to start the day. The main takeaway from that experience was a real sense of gratitude for the protective forces in society. The feeling of coming to rely on a great authority of sorts to keep you safe from the boogeyman, something that few people have ever had to deal with. This feeling of vulnerability and swallowing your pride. But also it made the experience of playing Clock Tower a lot more relatable. Clock Tower was originally released for the Super Nintendo in 1995, but my first impression was the 3D PlayStation version that came out only a year later. In this game, you're tasked with running and hiding from a murderous stalker known as the Scissor Man. He pursues you while brandishing a pair of giant shears, which he snaps menacingly whenever he's coming in for the kill. You can't defeat the Scissor Man, and you can only use weapons as a last resort. And even then, they're just single-use items, scattered around the level like mushrooms waiting to be picked. Most of the game is about running and, more importantly, hiding. There's no guarantee that whatever room you've trapped yourself inside will offer the hiding spot or defensive weapon that you need. Sometimes you just have to wait and hope that you can dodge the Scissor Man's attack, which almost seems like 50-50 at times. This, combined with a multitude of endings and branching storylines, gives each playthrough of Clock Tower an unpredictable, chaotic feeling, while still granting you with a great degree of player agency. Ever since its release, Clock Tower has largely been underappreciated for its lasting influence on the survival horror genre, often being overshadowed by its contemporary rival Resident Evil. Clock Tower has launched a range of sequels, spiritual successors, and games that utilize this kind of stalker gameplay. So in this video I'm going to be talking about a couple of different titles that I know personally, and I'm going to talk about the psychology, appeals and subtext of these so-called stalker games. So I'm going to compare 8 different stalkers from 4 different games. The Scissor Man from Clock Tower, MrEdxwx from Resident Evil 2, the Nemesis from Resident Evil 3, and the 5 stalkers, Devilitis, Daniela, Ricardo and the 2 forms of Lorenzo from Haunting Ground. I was going to go into the Xenomorph from Alien Isolation, but I decided to take him out because I don't really consider him to be a stalker gameplay wise. He's more of something that you have to navigate your gameplay around, as opposed to something that you're actively evading. Also, I wanted to focus on stalkers original to video games. If I were to include the Xenomorph into the mix, I'd inevitably have to delve into the aspects of the movie, and I didn't want to stretch the subject matter of this video out too wide. Also, there's another disclaimer: when I talk about the Nemesis, I mean the 1999 version, and when I talk about MrEdxwx, I'm talking about the 2019 version, because I believe these are the best respective versions of each character. I feel that Capcom vastly improved on one, while kind of ruining the other, but I'll be talking more about that later. To me, the subconscious appeal of the stalker is that it grinds against the entire appeal of a video game experience. Video games, for the most part, are power trips. Even in their barest forms, the player is asserting their dominance over the rest of the game's environment. Even Pac-Man's trial of running away from ghosts comes with the promise that the hunted will eventually become the hunter, Space Invaders had people imagining in their mind's eyes some epic space battle in which they're blasting away alien ships left, right and centre. Even games that appear innocent, non-violent and non-destructive like The Sims are massive power trips when you think about it. You have complete control over these characters' lives and you can exercise quite a lot of cruelty over them. But in a Stalker system, you're at a clear disadvantage. The amount of harm you're able to inflict on these Stalkers varies from game to game, but they all have a major advantage over you in at least one category, usually when it comes to the amount of damage they can take or the amount of damage they can impart. There's a voice inside you saying that they should be the ones running away from you, not the other way around. By inverting the traditional hunter and prey scenario, the player is being harshly reminded that not all conflict is desirable, that the reality of violence is actually a lot more unpleasant than the watered down version we experience in video games. The Stalker does not have to completely dominate your character physically and mentally, but they do have to make you feel afraid and vulnerable enough so that you no longer feel like the most powerful force in the game. In some cases, these Stalkers can seem evenly matched with you, like the Scissorman, who at times can be compromised just by a well-timed push, which can see him falling to the ground, giving you time to escape. At one point you can even just throw a blanket over him and then run away. But his real strength, aside from his ability to one-hit kill you, is that the Scissorman will just keep on returning over and over again. It's an inversion of the classic video game setup, in which you, the player, can just restart the game as soon as you die. Now it's the opponent who can hit the restart button on your game. So in a way there's another force competing with you for that power trip. The Stalker is as much a main character as the hero or heroine, so their dominance over your character in a way becomes the dominance over the entire video game, which is no longer a celebration of your skills as a video game player, but a celebration of that terrifying antagonist. This might explain why the covers of both Nemesis and Clock Tower have the Stalker looking down at the player, foreshadowing the fact that you, the player, will be in a lower, inferior position to them. Why Stalkers always tend to have their own theme songs to let you know when they've spotted you. Many of the theme songs share similar characteristics. They're bassy, jittery and synthetic, which really highlights the mindless, denatured elements of these killers. They instill a sense of panic that lets you feel what your character is feeling, yet they have a high energy vibe like that of an action movie. But they often begin with a very low, bassy note that verges onto brown note territory. It's almost like the music is telling you that you're about to shit your pants. If you consider that historically, males have formed the majority of video game players, it only adds to the power trip irony that all of these games have you controlling a female character, with the exception of Resident Evil 2, if you choose to play as Leon. And many of these characters are not hugely experienced in combat or self-defense, if at all, with the exception of Jill Valentine. This really plays into that trope of the final girl, where you're probably going to be physically weaker than your opponent, but also more skilled at evasion, and usually a lot faster. The speed at which these Stalkers can move varies from game to game, with some slower than you, some faster, some going about the same speed. But all that really matters is that the Stalker can move fast enough to keep you moving. In Clock Tower, the Scissorman moves pretty slow, but he has a wide reach which can one-hit kill you. So you're tasked with steering as clear away from him as possible. So as slow as he may be, he still feels very dangerous all the same. MrEdxwx, on the other hand, can move at a brisk walk or a power walk if he sees you, so you habituate yourself to getting as far away from him once he sets his eyes on you. Nemesis can actually sprint, and a lot faster than you at that, but every time he spots you there's always going to be a fair amount of distance between you and him, meaning you certainly can get away, but you can't waste a single second in doing so. In Haunting Ground, each stalker has their own stamina meter, but so does your character, so the speed at which your chase is occurring can vary enormously. But levels in Haunting Ground often have these wide, expansive rooms with multiple doors, providing a huge number of opportunities to escape. But unlike Sizman, none of these other stalkers can just one-hit kill you like that. Although through a mix of chance, bad timing, or player error, you can find yourself in a situation where you're completely helpless and vulnerable to multiple attacks. So what makes a stalker so frightening in a video game is really not what it does, but what it makes you, the player, do. Specifically, run and hide, which really grinds against the conditioning of video games because it's much more passive behaviour than what we're used to. But at the same time, the game is not making us do it. We're running and hiding on our own volition because we know it's the best option given the circumstances, even though all these stalkers can be fought in some way, shape or form, even if only as a last resort. So on one hand you're still given that sense of agency, but you're likely to use it to avoid being overpowered by a largely much more powerful foe. We're given that player agency we expect to receive, while also being denied of that power trip fantasy. Nemesis probably does the best single-handed job at subverting this fantasy. He literally sprints at the player, chasing you from room to room, knocking you down with punch after punch. He even attacks you with a rocket launcher, which really shows that he has far higher cognitive and motor skills than really any other creature we've encountered in the series so far. It's almost like as you evolve as a Resident Evil player, the game itself is evolving and mutating into something much more frightening than before. He's also quickly established his powerful force in that he's introduced with killing Brad Vickers, which proves that he is indeed capable of fulfilling his mission. Take a second to compare that to his introduction in the remake, in which he's so stupid that, despite tracking down a completely unprepared Jill to her home, significantly advantaged by the element of surprise, he's still incapable of beating her and ends up getting himself trapped inside the apartment like a moron. In the original game, Jill's evasion of Nemesis felt mostly like a combination of luck and circumstance, in addition to Jill just being able to run quite fast. But you had no doubt in your mind that this Nemesis was seconds away from killing her. Encounters were brief, quick and terrifying. Meanwhile, the remake is constantly forcing you to square off against him, only shoving his blatant incompetence in your face. By trying to give you more of Nemesis, the ultimate experience amounts to less. The designers of the original Nemesis understood to keep it simple. A hideous monster sprinting towards you was terrifying. You did not need Dragon's Breath or web slinging or tentacle mind control in order to be established as a threat. But going back to the apartment scene also highlights another problem. You're introduced to the Nemesis before the proper gameplay even begins, which is kind of a mistake. Ideally, the Stalker is not introduced straight away. Rather, the game should take its time to introduce its characters and other mechanics, sort of lulling you into a false sense of security. The Resident Evil 2 remake does this very well, as you don't encounter your Stalker until a good hour or so into the game, by which point you become pretty familiar with the controls, the threats and the save points, and the overall layout of the police station. Boarding up windows, fixing statues and clearing out the undead all give you this proud feeling that you're putting things back together, only for this chaotic new mechanic to come in and screw everything up. MrEdxwx emerges after a long, grueling boss fight, at which point the player is expecting some nice respite time. Like all good stalkers, it's about subverting the player's expectations. MrEdxwx is an effective stalker in this regard in that he doesn't play by the same rules that you've been used to up to this point. And like all good stalker games, the Resident Evil 2 remake is a relatively short game, and the time in which a stalker is active is even shorter, especially if you choose to play the clear campaign. What this means is that it becomes hard to familiarise yourself with the stalker's behaviour. A game at Clock Tower can last you anywhere between 1 and 5 hours, depending on your actions. Even longer if you're me, but I always take a long time to complete video games. But even until the very last moment, this man was doing things that surprised me, such as emerging from an area I assumed safe or uncovering a hiding spot I thought he didn't know about. Haunting Ground, which was a spiritual successor to Clock Tower of sorts, also does the same thing. Each of Haunting Ground's Stalkers have different gameplay mechanics, intelligence and stamina levels, weapons and AI patterns, meaning you never know how the new Stalker is going to behave compared to the old one. So these Stalkers, including Scissorman, all have an unpredictable feeling about them, and in Clocktower's case, the game is short enough for nothing to feel all that repetitive. From what I was able to gather, I got the feeling that this was the main reason that Alien Isolation's runtime took so much flack. I think nobody has a problem with an 18-hour campaign in theory, but when the game is based around fear and an unpredictable enemy, that eponymous alien on which the entire game is based around becomes a little bit predictable after a while. This means that a Stalker should not just appear briefly, but infrequently as well. There's a real balancing act to the frequency of appearance. Appearing too frequently can become frustrating in the case of Daniela from Haunting Ground or Scissorman from Clocktower, while appearing not frequently enough can make the Stalker seem ineffectual, such as the original MrEdxwx from 1998. Debilitis from Haunting Ground and Nemesis are probably the best examples of how to appear just frequently enough so that the player is kept on edge, but being elusive enough for the player to be able to let their guard down, all the while making it hard for the player to acclimatise themselves towards their behaviour. But at a more psychological level, we're kind of creeped out because the whole time they're chasing us, we're subconsciously wondering to ourselves, what are they doing? How they occupy their time when they're not chasing down our vulnerable, usually female heroes? Are they plotting the next move? Are they monitoring you from a distance, waiting for the right moment to strike? Are they resting and recuperating, or immersing themselves in something completely different? It's this mystery that only adds to the uncertainty about them. So a good Stalker is one who hides his secrets. Unlike the Nemesis tyrant, MrEdxwx does not vocalize. You know the Nemesis is after stars because he says he is, but you cannot think of any reason why MrEdxwx would target this rookie cop or this college student. Meanwhile, Debilitis in Haunting Ground takes the uncertainty of the player and brings it into a much more grounded scenario. You're not even sure if this guy actually wants to hurt you. There's kind of an innocence about him. There are many points where you aren't even sure if you're in danger or not. This fixation on your character may just be an innocent crush. Often he'll act calm and shy, and on other occasions he'll make a grab for you, but it could just be that he's trying to give you a hug or a kiss. But the uncertainty kicks in all the same, and you want to get as far away from him as possible. In this sense, he's probably the most realistic depiction of a stalker in a video game. Any woman who has met a quote-unquote creepy guy has had this exact same feeling. He might be alright, but what if he wants to hurt me? There was a 2016 article called On the Nature of Creepiness, which really delves into how creepiness is often associated with strange men that have unusual hobbies. The abstract from this article says, among other things, that people perceived to be creepy are more likely male than female. And the two underlying components of creepiness is unpredictability and a sexual threat, the two qualities that Debilitis perfectly evokes. It's his infatuation with the player character and his volatile personality that make him a real unsettling presence who is able to do much more with less. He's about as polar opposite of the Nemesis as you can get. While one is hideous to look at, razor-focused, aggressive and goal-oriented, the other is sort of cute, but there's still an underlying sense of danger about him. So despite his cartoonish appearance, Debilitis evokes this very real-world creepiness. He's not as frightening to look at as the Nemesis or Scissorman, but he creates a real sense of unease that is much more like what we see with real-world predators and stalkers, rather than any of these other characters. There's also the whole subject of sexual objectification and how that puts the player into a deliberately uncomfortable position, but that's a huge topic worth discussing in another video, and I will do that when I do my analysis video on Haunting Ground. So the idea of the creepy predator and unveiled intentions really leads into a push for the stalker to be exposed, both physically and metaphorically. The stalker is often revealed to be much more seemingly innocent than originally expected, such as in Clocktower, but I won't go into further detail just in case of spoilers, although I do plan to do another video delving deep into Clocktower as well, which will include spoilers. But this notion can be seen in movies like Friday the 13th and Psycho, films which both toy with the idea of an unexpected identity reveal for the killer, which also takes on an innocent alter ego. But on the flip side, some stalkers gradually become even more horrifying than they originally appear. Both the Nemesis and MrEdxwx slowly mutate into these hideous abominations. Meanwhile, Lorenzo in Haunting Ground is still chasing Fiona even after burning down into a skeleton. It's all part of the transactional outcome of stalker and prey. The stalker intends to push the victim to absolute limits, but the victim ends up doing the same to the stalker. The ugliness beneath them is gradually revealed the more desperate they become. The stalker pushes not just your character to her limits, but you, the player, as you're obliged to find out exactly how powerful the stalker is. You want to know his strengths and his weaknesses, whether physically or cognitively. And to do so, you ideally want to have a range of different options for dealing with them. MrEdxwx is the most memorable stalker in recent video game history, but his downside as a stalker is really limited to the options for dealing with him. Fighting back can stun MrEdxwx temporarily, but this is often rarely worth the ammo expenditure. You cannot hide from MrEdxwx, as he always seems to know exactly where you are. This makes for fun gameplay in the sense that he derails your plans and leads you off into a potentially more dangerous path. But you may find yourself frustrated in that he is somehow always able to discover your perfect hiding spot. There's no tension in hoping that he doesn't come around the corner and see you huddled up and quivering. It can be kind of exhilarating facing your inevitable doom like that, but even more exhilarating would be the feeling of hiding the stalker coming within inches of your location and then walking away. Likewise, Nemesis gives you only the option to run, but it's more excusable in that the Nemesis only really appears when he has already spotted you, making the idea of hiding much less credible and adding to the fast-paced tone of that game. Clock Tower goes for the opposite approach. In that game, hiding is usually the only way to avoid the stalker. Whenever you enter a new area, you're encouraged to scout out as many hiding spots as possible and leave a mental note of them, knowing that you'll be needing them later. But if you can't find a hiding spot, it can become a little bit tedious in that he seems to just chase you forever. So rather than the tedium of repeatedly dying, it's the tedium of that music and these admittedly creepy gnashing blades that just never seem to come to an end. Eventually you may run into a scripted event which has your character outsmarting or temporarily stunning the Scissorman, but you can't always rely on these things. It may make the game frustrating at times, but it's a trade-off for making you feel uncertain and particularly vulnerable. Considering it was the first game of its kind, it kind of gets a pass on these things which are less excusable today. But of all these games, it would have to be Haunting Ground that really strikes the best balance between hiding, running and fighting. For most of the time, with its 5 stalkers, there are a fair amount of hiding spaces, but running away is almost always a viable option. However, your success in doing so really depends on your character Fiona's energy levels and psychiatric state. If your energy bar is low, you can't run so fast, which will give the slower Debilitus a chance to catch up to you. Meanwhile, if your panic meter is high, you might trip or bump into walls and struggle to move your character, which can leave you open to a gunshot from Ricardo. Debilitus is not really all that perceptive, but he can work himself up into a run and catch you if you're not careful. He won't instantly kill you either, but if he does have you cornered, it can be quite brutal to watch little Fiona being playfully smacked about by this guy. Your next stalker is the complete opposite. Daniela is smart, aggressive and perceptive, and she appears much more frequently than Debilitus, so you have to rely on much more aggressive tactics to counter her. There comes a point where she just seems to be constantly appearing, making the whole game feel like some sort of drawn-out domestic violence simulator. You'll definitely be missing your more infrequent encounters with a more innocent Debilitus after a while. Ricardo is not as fast as Daniela, but he does carry a gun. Overall, he's pretty easy to avoid, and at times he feels more like he's toying with Fiona as opposed to Daniela, who legitimately seems to want to kill her. I think this is a problem that the Nemesis faced in the 2020 remake of Resident Evil 3, as it seemed more interested in tossing Jill about and showing off as opposed to actually killing the heroine. There's all this slow, drawn-out confrontation that feels much more like a professional wrestling match than what the Nemesis is supposed to be. In the original game, the Nemesis kind of seemed single-mindedly focused on killing Jill. Yeah, he did toss her around a little bit, but this was really only so he could get her onto the ground and apply more punches. In fact, you could really get yourself into a lot of danger if he had you on all fours. Both Ricardo and Debilitis toy with the heroine, but unlike the 2020 Nemesis, this really makes much more sense in accordance with their character, because they are implied to be sexual predators, with Ricardo wanting to impregnate Fiona, and Debilitis kind of regarding Fiona as an addition to his collection of dolls. So as you're running away from Debilitis, you're doing so with the knowledge that he literally views you as a plaything, which is ironic considering that the video game is essentially a plaything for you, and yet the game is also playing with you in a weird way. But with the new version of Nemesis, this doesn't really make sense. This is a biological weapon that is supposed to be programmed for the sole purpose of killing Jill Valentine, and it barely seems committed to that goal at all. There's no sexual element to his relationship with Jill, so there's no real reason why Nemesis shouldn't just get himself together and do his job. The final adversary in Haunting Ground, Lorenzo, takes on two different forms. First as the disabled, wheelchair-bound geriatric, and secondly as a younger, supernatural version. Elderly Lorenzo is weak but fast, and he has the opportunity to one-hit kill Fiona if positioned correctly. So his fast, creepy movements and danger factor make him more akin to like a venomous spider than anything else. Despite being the weakest and the briefest stalker in the game, he comes across for many of us as the creepiest, and he's the only one besides Scissorman who is able to one-hit kill. Young Lorenzo is probably the most tedious stalker due to his supernatural abilities, which really grind too heavily against the rest of the game's tone. There was always a supernatural element to Haunting Ground, but this final act took it to an extreme level which almost made the rest of Fiona's encounters feel somehow less significant. Fiona was able to overcome the other stalkers, such as Debilitis and Daniela, through a combination of stamina, resourcefulness, and assistance from Huey. But with this final stage, the game becomes such a nightmare that you're really unable to be certain of what's real anymore. But I think all that's beside the point, because the stalker mechanics in Haunting Ground are probably the best I've seen in the game so far. And I attribute this to the sheer number of options you have for dealing with your opponent. So it brings me to talking about the potency of the player character. In Haunting Ground, Fiona can run, hide, or fight back, and the choices this gives you during any situation really only accentuates her pre-existing vulnerabilities as a character. It's a mistake in some games such as Outlast that you're given absolutely no option to fight back against your opponent. I understand the appeal of making your character seem vulnerable, but doing this by preventing your character from fighting back at all doesn't really have the effect of making your character feel vulnerable. It just makes them feel impotent and like the game is trying to limit your player agency. So by contrast, Fiona can fight back. Not only can she use Huey, but she can kick her opponent and throw objects with the capacity to explode or stun. And rather than removing that feeling of vulnerability, it actually adds to it, because you can't always rely on these devices. By giving a character just a sample of that power, it helps you realize just how powerless you truly are. Which I think is a testament to how well Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was designed. This version of Jill Valentine was, at the time, the most powerful Resident Evil character you could control. She had more guns and ammunition at her disposal. She could dodge, she was faster and could perform a 180-degree turn. All of this was to act as a counter against the most powerful adversary in the series. Jill's heightened skills actually complement the skills of the Nemesis, making him seem even more potent when you realize how your own increased power won't be enough. which is where I think that the 2020 remake again really drops the ball. Aside from a neat little role, Jill doesn't really feel any more powerful than Leon or Claire from the previous remake. If I'm not mistaken, it feels like they've just recycled Claire's animations and used them with Jill. As a result, Jill 2020 moves in kind of this casual way that Claire did in the previous remake. It was more excusable in the Resident Evil 2 remake because MrEdxwx moved relatively slow. In the original Resident Evil 3, Jill moved more like Leon in a bit of a stride, as if she was actually trying to get away from Nemesis. And you could hear the panic and the urgency in her voice as she spoke.
I'm sorry about your daughter, but there isn't gonna be any rescue. We have to get out of here.
Compare that to the remake, where she sounds a bit bored and aloof. Like she just wants all this T-virus bullshit to go away so that she can go back to watching Netflix or texting her boyfriend or whatever.
Right. How's that going for you?
Where's the urgency? Where's the desperation? The developer's effort to give the character sort of a sexy mass market appeal really come with the baggage of like an unconvincing hero, which leads to an unintimidating villain, resulting in a weak plot. But by putting Jill into a more unsympathetic position, the game also loses the appeal of the Stalker. You want to defend your helpless hero, and if they come across as too self-reliant and resourceful, their protective instinct is gone. In the remake, Jill helps UBCS because she's doing it for the innocent civilians.
I'm in. But I am on their side, not yours.
So the game is really putting her up on a pedestal as like this selfless, perfect hero. Whereas in the original Resident Evil 3, Jill only agrees to work with UBCS because she wants to get out of Raccoon City alive.
So Jill, did you decide to help us out? It looks like we're the only ones who survived. We should work together.
No, we can't trust her.
Why? But Sergeant, we need her help. Our unit's down to you, me, and Lieutenant Mikhail. That's it. And Mikhail's hurt bad. If we don't cooperate, we won't be walking away from this mission.
Fine.
Yeah, she did try to help people along the way, but ultimately she was terrified for her own life. That made her character more relatable. Think back to the earlier days. We felt protective towards characters like Fiona or Jennifer or Helen or Rebecca, because these characters felt vulnerable. I think that might explain why, of all the characters in the Resident Evil franchise, it's actually Leon who's the most beloved. He was put in such a difficult and unfair position in his first appearance, and that made us sympathize with him. Claire went out of her way to find Chris, and when she discovered that he isn't there, she didn't really have much reason to stay around. Whereas with Leon, it was his job. He didn't really have much choice in the matter. But despite the fact that you as the player take up a sort of protective mantle for your character, you still begin to doubt yourself as to whether or not you can accomplish a task on your own. This leads you into depending on some sort of higher authority, higher power, or more competent force. Just like how I needed the police to come to my rescue, you often find your heroic character being saved from the Stalker by some more competent or powerful force, whether it's police in Clock Tower or Ada Wong and William Birkin in Resident Evil 2. These games ask that you surrender to a higher power of sorts. They remind you that you're not all alone, that you shouldn't put yourself on such a high pedestal that you believe that there's nobody else to help you. It's been suggested that one of the true downsides of violent video games, rather than encouraging real-world violence, is that they can reduce impulse control. If an obstacle can simply be shot away, then it encourages that sort of make-it-go-away mentality in real life, leading to short tempers and a low tolerance towards real-world challenges and obstacles. This will explain why a lot of multiplayer online shooter games are the ones that are often seen as having the most toxic fan base. Now, if all this is true, then in a way the Stalker game is kind of the antidote to that embarrassing trend. These games kind of force you to stop and realise that not all things in life can be solved by blasting things away with a weapon. Sometimes you have to use your brain, or at other times you need to run and hide and give yourself into some sort of higher authority. Or in my case, which I shared with Helen Maxwell in Clock Tower, it was a simple matter of calling the police and hoping for the best. So that's all I have to say today regarding stalkers and horror games, the denial of the video game power trip, and the underdog hero. I'm actually planning to do a separate video as an offshoot from this one regarding the MrEdxwx character, because I think there's a lot to say there. In fact, I've already almost finished the draft for that one. If you're interested in this kind of content, please subscribe. Also, I've drawn from quite a few different articles and resources, which I've included in the links below if you're interested in some further reading. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and thank you for watching.